Here we are again. Welcome back. This is week 4, lecture 2, with the title The Observant Movement. Now, this lecture follows very naturally, in my view anyway, from the previous lecture on the pastoral theology in the later Middle Ages and looking at Jordan's um, exposition of the Lord's Prayer. Because there, I mentioned at least briefly this secondary religionization or Christianization process, which I then refer to as, or have referred to as religionization. That the religionization process is how to make one a religious. And originally, that, as I said, had a legal definition in terms of joining a monastic order. When you joined a monastic order, you entered in statu religionis, in the state of religion. And what we see developing, especially with Jordan, but also more broadly, is that concept expanded. So the religious, and we still have that term, the religious, members of religious orders, um, would apply to everybody. That everybody should be, as Jordan said, a saint. Every Christian should be a saint, bright and shining. Everybody could be a religious. And that broadening of that perspective is what I refer to as religionization, and it had a general sense that kind of begins in that 12th century Reformation, as Giles Constable referenced it. But the general pastoral endeavor, that secondary Christianization process, that process after Europe becomes Christian, now what do we do? How do we actually teach people to be Christian? That is religionization in the general sense, but then in the specific sense, it is the emergence and spread. There's another word, not propagation, but there's another spread word spread of what I call micro religions, whereby the religious orders were all micro religions, but there were others as well. These were groups that focused on a given principle, founder, identity, and so there were many different religions within Christendom. And already in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas addressed that question explicitly, whether Christianity was one religion or whether there were numerous religions in Christianity. And Thomas said there are numerous religions in Christianity. He also made it almost an individualized thing, too. You could have your own private devotion or take your own vows, private vows, and that would be your religion. How do you fulfill your religious obligations to God and then to society? As we've talked about anyway in brief before, going back to the Roman understanding and Cicero's understanding of religion and what that was. So this was an increasingly important movement in the later Middle Ages, and the observant movement became an official designation within the religious orders, or at least within the Mendicants, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian hermits, and then somewhat in the Benedictines too. These were movements that say we are going to be truly observant. And what are we going to observe? We're going to be truly observant of our rule, the monastic rule that we follow. And that was the technical definition was the observantia regularis, the observance of the rule or the regular observance. And you may say, well, why? Didn't they all follow the rule? Hadn't they always followed the rule? Yes, they had. But this was a feeling that within the orders, they'd fallen away from their ideals. They were not really following the rule, even if they said they were. And that was a problem. They'd fallen away from religious observance. And the endeavor to combat that, to initiate a reformation of that religious life, became central to the monastic orders, especially to the Augustinians as well, which we'll be talking a lot about. And that's why this is being addressed here, kind of an outgrowth of this general religionization process and the pastoral endeavor and catechesis as such, to a more specific understanding of what did that mean within a particular group with a group identity. And that is what we're going to be looking at a little bit more today. Now, this will be very important too, I think, for understanding Luther and what was going on with Luther and some of the dynamics there. And it's not until actually I went back to check to make sure. Um, week 6, when chapters 2 through 5, or 2, 3, and 5, we're kind of skipping chapter 4, in my Luther and Reformation of the later Middle Ages, is assigned, where I talk a fair amount about the observance and Luther's participation in it and how that all worked for him. And so this lecture is designed not only in terms of the kind of the chronological development, but also as getting you ready and introducing you to the concept. So when you do come to read it in Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, you'll know what the observant movement is, what the observants were all about, and some of the background there too. So that is what we're looking at today. And I hope it will help you as we go further along. Now, that being said, we can then move and look at the origins of this observant movement because it was an administrative designation. We find it in the sources within the Augustinians, and I'm going to be talking primarily about the Augustinians because that's what I know. I don't know all that much about the Franciscan and the Dominican observance movement or the Benedictine. I know some things about it, but I know the Augustinian observance fairly well. So that's why I'm talking about the Augustinians. And of course, Luther was an Augustinian hermit himself. Now, origins. With this upsurge in piety, there began to be this sense of we are better than others. We are being more observant in the broader sense. Um, and therefore, we have to make a distinction between those who are following our rules and our way of life from those who are not. Now, as I think I mentioned, there began administrative designation in the Augustinians beginning in 1387. The cloister, the Augustinian cloister in Siena, in Italy, received permission from the prior general to be outside of the normal order's hierarchy, the district vic or the district prior. The prior, there's a prior general, and then the provincial prior, and the district priors, and so on we go. So they were removed from that hierarchy and placed directly under the authority of the prior general, the head of the whole order, who was under the authority of the Pope. They said, okay, we want to do things differently from what our superiors were saying, and therefore, prior general, we're asking permission to be directly under your authority. Now, this should maybe sound a little bit familiar. Why do I say that? Because that was the movement, the same basic structural movement in any case, with the communes in the 11th century and on into the 12th century, the rise of cities, the free imperial cities that I talked about, who removed themselves with the king or emperor's permission and blessing from the feudal hierarchy. So they were outside that feudal hierarchy. The mendicant orders themselves, as some of the other earlier reformed monastic groups, such as, first of all, Cluny, and then the Cistercians, and so the new monasticism of the 12th century, 11th, 12th centuries, were outside of episcopal control. So all of a sudden, with this kind of overarching feudal structure that originally was intended to incorporate everything with their place and within the hierarchy, there were exceptions. And the free cities were one, the communes, free cities were one, and then these monastic orders became others, and now within these monastic orders, there began to be a further division between what were called the conventuals, everybody at the time, and then the observants. And Siena is the first one, the congregation, we'll call it congregation at Siena in 1387. And then other congregations sprung up, as you'll read about in week 6, in chapter 5, I think it is. The congregation of Lombardy, of Augustinians, the Lombard observant congregation, was themselves actually directly under the Pope, not even under the prior general. They were directly under the Pope. That was not that was the exception more than the norm, but could happen that way. And in Italy, there were a number of observant congregations that grew up, whereas in Germany, there was just one, the Saxon the congregation of Saxony, the observant congregation province of Saxony, Thuringia, Saxony. And I'll come back to that. But aside from this legal administrative distinction between the observance and the conventuals, we have to ask, what led to that? What brought that about? Can we really say that is the first time we see observant movement beginning was with this legal definition? And a scholar who studied pretty thoroughly the observant congregations in Italy said, we're really stuck because all we have are the administrative sources. We don't know what it was like on the ground, so to speak. Obviously, this was coming from somewhere, but we don't know where because we don't have those kinds of sources. Well, actually, we do. But that wasn't known back when Catherine Walsh wrote her two-part article on the observant congregation of Siena um, in Italy in general. Because one of my discoveries, actually, in my view, I'm not sure how many people agree with me, but it is in my view. We have it in a little known work to the point where I've written, I think, most of what's been written about him. Antonius Ramphagolus, who was an Augustinian hermit. There you see on the PowerPoint slide OESA, which stands for Order Eremitarum or Ordo Eremitarum Sancti Augustini, which is Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. And his work is Figurae Bibliorum. And you'll say, 1354 to 1377 / I have that as the date of it. And that is because this is one of those texts that is fascinating and incredibly difficult. I'm not going to go through the whole story. I'll try not to go through the whole story about my discovery of Ramphagolus. It goes back to when I was a graduate student. Actually, my first year in graduate studies. And my advisor, Heiko Obermann, knew I was interested in the Augustinians and the observance. And so he gave me this book that he had in his library, his personal library. It was published in 1609. He didn't know much anything about it, but he said there was a section in there on the religiosi, on the religious. I thought I might be interested. So he let me take it home. So I took it home, this 1609 book published. And I was working on my paper. This is going to be my first paper in a seminar, my first semester in graduate school. And my Latin at the time was not all that great. I was working on it, but it still wasn't all that great. And this was still an early modern book published in 1609. So there's abbreviations and things. And I thought, I'm not really sure I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at this now. I kind of briefly looked at it, because I'm not sure how much I can do with it. So I kind of wrote up my paper, and then about a week or so, or maybe a week and a half before I was to give my paper, I thought, yeah, but you know what? Darn it, he gave me this thing. He may ask me about it. I better try to find out something about it, at least about the author. So I did a little digging and studying, very little about him at all. This Antonius Ramphagolus. But what I was able to find out, also actually in a 17th century Augustinian bibliography or discussion of authors, collection, there's a couple of different collections of talking about the authors of the order and what they wrote and when they lived, those kinds of things. Like a reference book at the time in the 17th century. This was a printed edition too. So I looked at that. And he died in approximately around the year 1422. He was born, supposedly, but they weren't even sure when he was born. This book, the Figurae Bibliorum, he wrote supposedly in around 1380 or so. It was dedicated to his students in Naples, his beloved students in Naples. He was at the Council of Constance and preached against Huss. He became a well-known preacher at Constance against Huss. He was seen as one of the outstanding preachers of his day. And this was all unknown to people. I remember going in like the next morning to see Heiko, and I said, that book you gave me, yeah. He said, yeah. I said, what do you know about the author? He said, nothing at all, really. I said, well, he died about 1422, and he came out of his chair. He almost fell over. That's what the excitement of this thing. And there it was, all been sitting in his library. That's just kind of some ways that how scholarship can be done. Made for not the greatest or smoothest presentation because I couldn't find out all that much in a week and a half or so before I had to give my paper. And again, as I said, my Latin wasn't as good as it needed to have been to have done bang up job on it at that time. But I started working at it. And as a little footnote, just for the funness of things, Heiko said, "Well, this may be your dissertation." He said, "And for that, you need a copy of the text." I said, "So," he said, "there are two kinds of thoughts about texts, books like this. One is it's an object itself that's important, and the other is that the text is so important. In this case, I think the text is so important, you need to have your own copy. Um, copy it." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, go to Kinko's. There's a Kinko's copier, copy shops, and copy it on the copier." So I said, "Okay." He said, "Try not to destroy the book, but be careful, but copy it." I said, "Okay." So I went and had to go into Kinko's and get the copy machine and open it up and carefully open up the binding because it was a small little book, very thick but small little book. And opening it up and pressing it down, hitting copy for all the different pages. Anyway, so that's that. And I've been working on Ramphagulus ever since. And part of the reason I haven't published a separate study of Ramphagulus is I kept finding new things, more perplexing things, to make the whole picture of who was this person, when did he live, how did it all fit together, um, very difficult to discern, and I still don't have a handle on it. I'm hoping I may be able to finally get it all together, actually, for my next book, as part of my next book, Augustinian Theology in the Later Middle Ages, Volume 2. But the point is this, one of the things I found, first of all, the earliest manuscript that I knew about at first was dated 1384. But then I found another one dated 1377. Now that is why that 1377 is there, because those two manuscripts were at least cataloged and known as a date. And they were somewhat similar, except the 1377 manuscript did not contain the preface to his students in Naples. It just started off right with the text. And what this text is like, it's called the Figures of the Bible. It was like a handbook for preachers, is basically what this was. It was, or is, or was, or is, organized alphabetically and thematically according to themes. Virtues and vices are there. The church is there. Starts out with abstinence. I don't have it all memorized in my head. There are a fair number of chapters. Goes through, and the last one, of course, is Christos or Christus, because with the Greek X as the ending letter. But there's a chapter on the church, De Ecclesia. There's a chapter on sin. There's a chapter on the vices too, on pride and lechery, on Satan. So it really is kind of a comprehensive overview of the moral theology at the time. And then and for each chapter, he would go through and identify the different passages in the Bible that especially apply to it, and then would give the literal interpretation and then the figural or the spiritual interpretation, also with other Bible passages. So it made for a handbook where someone, if they were giving a sermon, had to throw it together pretty quickly, could use it very quickly and get some really good material with biblical passages and all along. It also, at least in the manuscripts at this time, the 1377 and the 1384, included their indices at the end of the book. So there was all indexed. You could look things up, and there are actually tables. And it's an amazing instrument. Way to put it together, and that the development of what's been called finding tools was a major development in, let's say, knowledge technology at the time. So you can search it. I mean, we have our Google searches and things. Think a little bit about how difficult it might have been to find things before the internet, and still is if things are not on the internet. And this is even before we have repertoria and other finding guides and helps to find quotations, passages, and all those other things. But also within a book, how do you find things? Now, all well and good until I found an earlier manuscript in The Hague. in the Netherlands. Um, it had not been or been cataloged in The Hague, but not in the references that I had seen to where some of his manuscripts were listed before. Um, and I call that up, and it was also the date was given was like 1392 or something like that. Um, but that date, 1392, was not the text of Rampogolus's Figura Bibliorum, because his text, Figura Bibliorum, was bound together with a couple of other texts. And it was like that, the last text that was dated to 1392. You go to Rampagolus in that combination, it was bound later, and his text, there's an explicit at the end of it, giving the explicit date 1354. Now that's why the 1354 is there. Now, what does all this mean? It means that it's a real mess. And it gets even more complex because there was another Augustinian, Bindus of Siena, who wrote a couple of similar types of works. And Rampagolus wrote a couple of other similar types of works too. And in some ways, these all mixed and matched. And it's really difficult to tell. Is one of Bindus of Siena's work simply Rampagolus's that was attributed to Bindus, or did Bindus use it and copy it and put it off on his own? Or did Rampagolus copy from Bindus? It just gets to be a real god-awful mess. And that's why, as I said, I haven't, figured it all out. I'm making my way through it, and I hope before too long that will be all at least detailed what I have found to this point in any case. Now, that was all kind of extra fluff, not fluff, because it's kind of an insight into how historical research comes about. And sometimes it's by chance, by luck. And the whole text itself is important. Okay, now, but you're not being examined on that. I'm not going to say compare and contrast the 1354 version of Figura Bibliorum with the later ones. There's a lot of differences. The 1354 edition is much shorter, or 1354 version is much shorter. Many fewer figurae included, so it's greatly expanded in 1377. Anyway, we'll go. It's a long story there. That's not the point. The point here is that section of the Religiosi that Heiko actually first gave it to me to look at, not knowing anything about it at all at that first point. Because here Rampagolus talks about the truly religious. And who are the truly religious? And that is where it gets very interesting indeed. There are certainly, they're the religiosi and the truly religious. There are the religiosi, just your common members of religious orders. But he said, but those are just the common. Then even within the orders, a lot of them are just common people. They're not really truly religious, who are truly fulfilling their vows and following the rule. Only these truly religious should be considered to be religious, because they're the only truly religious people there are. So even within the Augustinians and Franciscans and Dominicans, he refers to them as these three major orders. There are those who are just regular, and then there are still the truly religious. He said, and what happens is those who are not truly religious, who are not truly following the rule, infect those who try to, so that we cannot really live together. What we have to do is to be separate. We have to keep the truly religious separate from your average, everyday, run-of-the-mill Augustinian or Franciscan or Dominican. These truly religious are the only hope for the church, because only they live up to the ideals, or at least even try to. And they are the ones who are leading the church, to whom God, then he says, has given all wisdom and knowledge, which means also they are the ones that know how to interpret the scriptures. These truly religious. The others don't, because they have not been faithful to what they vowed to be. Now, it's quite a statement. But it's the first time, to my knowledge in any case, that I've seen an argument that these truly religious, the special group, has to be kept separate from the others in order to pursue their religious life. And that's the origins of the observance, that separation, that we are better. We are the reformed. I mean, Repagulus doesn't use that term. We are the reformed in terms of are affecting a reformation. As I said, Repagulus does not use that term, but it would be used very quickly thereafter and institutionalized in the Observantia Regularis, um, the institutionalized observant movement. So that's what we're kind of looking at, these origins. Now, keep in mind, too, this is in the midst of this crisis. 1354, shortly after the Black Death and the plague. It is in the midst of the 100 Years' War. It is with the papacy in Avignon. And then by 1377, 1384, we're in the midst of the schism. At least with 1384, things are running amok. And what is going on with the church? Those things that we talked about, the calls for reformation, as you read last week with the reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. And here we have within the monastic orders, at least the Dominican orders, this call for reformation. We need to effect and bring about a reformation of our religion, our way of life. And that is what led to the institutional separation. Now, obviously, too, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but think about it. If you were not one of these observant groups, how do you view them? Oh, these people, you self-righteous, pious people that think you're so good when you're not at all. We don't need reformation. We're doing just fine. Thank you very much. It's you people who are causing the problems. So there was a lot of conflict between what was called the conventuals, or the, let's say, normal, everyday Augustinians, and the observants, those who were saying we're special, we're different, we're going to get away from you people so we can live a truly religious life and truly be the Augustinian hermits, because you're not doing it. That's the sentiment and the debate that's going on, the argument, and that led then to the administrative separation of the order, which was a split. And here, if you go through the slide, the gray slide, institutional separation and conflict, and this is the two different hierarchies involved. Pope is there, the head of it all, and under the Pope is the prior general of the Augustinians. And then, as you're looking at the screen, on your left is the observants, and on your right are the conventuals. And if you just look at the right-hand side for a minute, that was the traditional hierarchy. The prior general, then underneath the prior general would be the provincial priors, a number of different priors, provinces within the order. That's how they were organized. And then there were also district priors, which I didn't include there. And then individual cloisters, and then the friars. Also, just as a little note, you see a nice little arrow going from the Pope to the Prior General, and then arrows from the Prior General to the Vicar General on the observant side, and to the Provincial Prior on the conventual side. And no further arrows. That's because for some reason, my Word wasn't working for me to get those arrows in below, even though I guess I did get one from the Vicar General to the Provincial Prior. So, but I think you get the idea, I hope, anyway, even without the arrows. So don't be confused by that, if you will. But that conventual side on the right-hand side was what was traditional, normal. But then on the left were these observant congregations. And an observant congregation was led by a vicar general who served as the vicar general of the prior. Except for the congregation in Lombardy, as I already mentioned, was directly under the Pope. But I think most others were underneath the prior general and not involved with the provincial priors. Those congregations had their own provincial priors and then their own individual cloisters. And they also had district priors too. And Luther actually became a district prior. But we'll get there when we get there. So this administrative split was between the conventuals and the observants, or as it became increasingly referred to as the reformed and the unreformed. We are going to bring about a reformation of this cloister, a reformation of this province, and that means introducing the observant movement, the observant reform movement. That consisted of reformation. And that was the only hope for the church, because that's the only way that we are the truly religious. And if God has only given the truly religious the gift of the Holy Spirit to understand how to interpret the scriptures, that's the only hope we have. Conflict, debate, all about Reformation. Now, I have it there too, underneath that, Reform and Reformation. And if you've already read the introduction and chapter 1 in Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, you know that is a distinction I argue against. And it's a traditional distinction. I think I've mentioned it before, going on. And the idea was that reform in the late Middle Ages, reform was going back to the ideals of their founders, original ideals, going back to that golden age of origins. Whereas Reformation was the Protestant approach in the 16th century, starting something new. That was the distinction. That late medieval reform, even though people said yes in the sources it says Reformation, but we refer to it as reform because that is what was looking at, is this looking back, trying to recapture this original charismatic experience. I would say absolutely not. Did they look back? They certainly looked back in terms of their ideals and whether or not they were following them. But the whole point was to go forward. Where do we go from here? And if we have fallen away from our ideals, of course we need to go back to them, but we have to get moving and going forward. And getting back to them is the only way we can bring about true change in this time of urgency, in the last days, and what hope there might be left. In the history of humanity, almost, I know this is an overstatement, there's been two ideas, overarching ideas, visions of the overall development that have almost always been there simultaneously, even though they're contradictory. One is the myth of the Golden Age. Oh, man, it used to be so good back in the day, but the world has gone to hell. Back in my day, man, I had to walk to school, barefoot in the snow for 4 miles. You guys are so, weak and soft and everything else. I don't know if you've heard those kinds of stories or not. I mean, actually, I never did. But that idea of it was better in the past, that golden age that we've lost, and everything has kind of progressed downward since then. Now, at the same time, there's been this constant idea of progress. We are the best that's ever been. We're continuously progressing. And so this kind of decline, looking back to a golden age, is there simultaneously with this idea, and yet we're still the best we've ever been. My God, now we have Tupperware. Look at us. Look at the developments. Obviously, things are better. And how those two ideas, grandiose ideas, meta narratives, if you want to say, fit together is rather difficult and awkward, to say the least. Now, the view that what was going on in the later Middle Ages and these calls for reformation were not real calls for reformation. They were calls for reform, return to that golden age, is missing the point. They had the term reform too. They could have used it, but they did not. They used reformation. Was there a difference in the concept between the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and of the observant reform movement and that in the 16th century? Yes, indeed. And we're going to be looking at some of those differences. But that should not undermine the urgent calls for reformation, as you read in the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. That urgency was there within the monastic orders too in the observant movement. That's what I want to get across to you. And what we do see, and as I've kind of indicated already in the observant movement here, is that we find reformation coming both from below and from above. From below is the Rampogolis view, that idea of we are going to group together, we people here, maybe just a few of my friends and friars here, and we're going to commit to effecting a reformation of how we live our lives, of how we are doing things, and that is going to grow and expand and expand. That is from below. whereas from above is the introduction of the Reformation by fiat, by the Prior General. It's the administrative side of things. And those two, from below and from above, need to always work together, and because they were always still there. I have a lot of instances. I talk about some in chapter 5 in the early 16th century with Giles of Viterbo, the prior general of the Augustinian hermits. His insistence on reformation is that we have to effect a reformation and bring this about. He says, the situation is dire. We cannot wait any longer. We have to bring about a reformation. Now, we'll get there too. But the prior generals, or the minister generals, whatever they're called in the various orders, were not the only ones trying to initiate reformation from above. Also, something there I have on that slide there, the reformation of the princes, because in Germany, in the empire, I should say, in the empire, there were princes who said, my gosh, I'm going to bring about a reformation. I'm going to effect a reformation of the religious life in my territories. And if you go back and remember, I tried to portray this sense of responsibility of the princes and the kings and the emperor, that they were responsible too for the spiritual well-being of their people. And it was incumbent upon them to provide for them, going back to that proprietary church. And they took it seriously. Now, I'm not saying all princes did, certainly not, but some really did. And especially in Saxony and in Württemberg, we have princes in the 15th century who said, I want the best for my people, my citizens, people I rule over. I want the reformation of the cloisters. I don't want unreformed cloisters. I want the reformed cloisters that have effected and brought about a reformation. And if they're not going to do it themselves, I will impose it from above. And the sense of I'm a prince, I'm a duke of Saxony, or I'm the Margrave of Brandenburg, or whatever. I am going to force this reformation from above. If you remember back, you're reading in the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, that was what the reformer to come was going to do. The king and priest, after the order of Melchizedek, would enforce reformation from above. That was going on within the empire in the 15th century with respect to the observant movement, because it was the observance who was the instrument of reformation. And that was the only possible way that Reformation would come about. Now, the leader in the later, I forget exactly when he was elected, 1498 or something like that. Leader of the Observant Congregation of Saxony was a man by the name of Johann Staupitz, the Augustinians. There had been some controversies in Saxony. Andreas Proles was the prior general, or the vicar general of the observance before. There was controversy concerning him. I talk a little bit about that in my book. And Staupitz wanted to try to end the conflict between the conventuals and the observants. And so he wanted to unite them both under his leadership. Now, that was his grand plan. There were issues there, and I talk about them in chapter 5. But Staupitz is a very important figure for us, because he was Luther's, in some ways, father confessor. He was Luther's superior. He's the one who instructed Luther to begin studying theology, to be ordained, and then to kind of take his place. And also promoted Luther within the order. Now, in 1506, Staupitz, with the purpose of bringing about this plan to unite the conventuals and the observants in Saxony, in the Observant Congregation of Saxony, within the province of Saxony, under his rulership, thus ending the conflict. Before that fell apart, which it did in the course of the 1510, 1511, 1512, and on, which you will read about, he issued new constitutions for the order, or at least for the observant congregation. 1506, there's the order's constitutions go back to 1290, the Regensburg's constitutions. And so, I mean, the basic administrative documents of a religious order, of a mendicant order like this, were the rule, Augustine's rule, and then the constitutions. And the constitutions were important. And Staupitz said, I need, for the observance here in Saxony, to issue new constitutions. The Regensburg constitutions aren't going to cut it. They're not good enough. They don't cover what we need to cover. I'm going to issue new constitutions. And he does, and the very title of it is indicative of the time. These are constitutions for the observant congregation of Saxony for the Reformation of Germany. Think of what that entails. This was Staupitz's plan to effect and bring about a reformation of Germany. Or I should say of the Germans, more likely, but within the empire. I have to go back. Gosh, what's the actual title? It's Germania. I think it's Germania, but should be translated not as Germany, but as the Germans, or the German people, not a political entity of Germany. But that's what he was doing with these constitutions. Now, I've compared the two, and actually, funnily enough, there's not a lot of difference between the Regensburg constitutions and Staupitz's constitutions. Some minor details, but not much. But his point was that we have to get our act together, basically, and these constitutions will do it. They will affect a reformation within the German-speaking territories and amongst the German people, and this is the way we go about it, and this is our hope. Now, Staupitz was and you'll read a lot about him in Lutheran Reformation in the later Middle Ages, because he's of central importance for Luther. Luther started out, there's his trip to Rome in 1510, which, if you've ever heard much about Luther before his trip to 1510 was kind of a big deal, but it's really explained what was behind that trip. It wasn't just a pilgrimage to Rome that then he saw what in his eyes was the lack of piety of the Italians, and all those things. But he went on that trip to oppose Staupitz's plan to unite the conventuals and the observance. He was chosen and selected from a number of with a few others from Erfurt to make this journey, because Staupitz was not listening to their pleas and petitions to block the union. So they said, we're going to appeal over his head. We're going to go right to the Prior General and ask him to stop it. That's why Luther went to Rome. We don't know if they met with Giles of Viterbo, the Prior General at the time. Actually, I better not say it was Giles of Viterbo, but it may have been his predecessor. But in any event, it's not clear if they met with the Prior General at the time in 1510. But what we do know is when Luther came back, aside from being shocked by what he considered to be a lack of piety and sincerity, a lack of reverence on the part of the Italian clergy. He said such famous things as, my God, they can say 10 masses in the time it takes me to say one. If you've ever been to Rome or to Italy in general, but Rome in particular, you probably know what I mean right now. I mean, there is this very odd nature about Catholicism in Rome and Italy. There's a lot of kitsch to it, and it takes a while to get used to, especially if you're coming from, quote unquote, the north. Northern Europeans, the dourness of the Northern Europeans. It takes a long time to get used to Italy. I think it's something that every Northern European and American should be forced to come to terms with, because it's really fantastic when you see it. It's not really impious. I mean, there used to be, anyway, I don't know if it's still there, but the Banco de Santo Spirito, the Bank of the Holy Spirit. That was just normal. Bank of the Holy Spirit, fine, no problem there. and the most ridiculous, kitschy things are sold right around the Vatican, tourist attractions and things. Um, it's bizarre. It really is. But there's also somehow an underlying piety and genuineness there that often is lacking in the more northern climes and cultures. Is more natural and all pervasive in Rome and in Italy. But that's gets into cultural differences and everything else, in which I'm not talking about because that's not my area, but just my observations. But anyway, going back to Luther, he was shocked by the what he considered a lack of reverence and piety on the part of the Italians. But he came back supporting Staupitz. Staupitz then, in 1512, after Luther received his PhD, which Staupitz had him do, also told Luther, he says, you know what, you need to take my place as the professor of Bible at the University of Wittenberg. The Elector of Saxony, by this time, Frederick the Wise, had established and founded the University of Wittenberg as his kind of new foundation in 1502, with Augustine as their patron saint. And Staupitz was the professor of the Bible, uh, one of the major theological professors in Wittenberg. And he just felt he had too many other responsibilities with his work for the order, his own theological writing, his own preaching. And we have a lot of his sermons and we have his theological treatises and such. So he said, I'm just going to get rid of my professorship at Wittenberg, and Brother Martin, you're going to take that over for me, which Martin then does. And in some ways, the rest is history. Not quite, because we'll read all about it, and it's very complex and not the traditional story. Probably that you have heard, if you have heard it, and if you haven't heard it, um, then you don't need to bother with it, because I'll be telling you the real story of how it all came about, and you'll be reading about that in my book. But it's amazing, amazing stuff. Luther, as we'll see later, um, was an Augustine. He then became a district vicar in charge of 12 cloisters, 12 monasteries, 12 cloisters. So he was rising up in the order with a lot of responsibility. Luther never talked about Reformation. That is something that I think is notable, important. There's a principle in history and in logic too, from medieval logic anyway, but also still today. That's called you can't really make an argument from silence. Just because someone does not say something doesn't mean they didn't hold to those ideas that we might think or assume. But you can't construct an argument based on silence. The fact that Luther never really talked about Reformation, or even when he's writing to the cloisters in his district or in a sub-district of the district, sub-province of the district, he doesn't talk about introducing the Reformation. Whereas the prior general at this time, Giles of Viterbo, in his general letters to the order as such, as well as to his letters to the provinces, was talking constantly about affecting and bringing about Reformation, introducing Reformation, and the urgent need for it. And Luther is like, okay, no, he's like oblivious to it. What impact did that have? Well, that gets into the issue of to what extent was Luther really aware of his own order's traditions, theological traditions, religious traditions? He was a member of the order, without question. Um, but how did he understand himself as an Augustinian hermit? Did he understand himself as following in the footsteps of Augustine, this bishop and hermit combination, living the most perfect life? Those are questions that we'll be looking at as we go along. He certainly had a devotion to Augustine, and we'll see that too. But to what extent it was formed by the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine or by the observance is questionable. And I think we have to ask that question because, in so many ways, within the order, Reformation was the talk of the day. Everybody was talking about Reformation and either against it, the conventuals, resisting it, or feeling it was the absolute necessity for society as such, because it was the observance of their own way of thinking and their own mentality that felt that if there's any hope at all for the church in these last days, it's the observance. There with the last slide, the last hope for the church. If urgency, return to a golden age, reformation within apocalyptic expectation. This sense of urgency in here, I return to that golden age, which I talked about earlier in this lecture. Was it just a looking back, an attempt to return to the ideals, or was it going back to the ideals and making them functional within this urgency of the last days in the battle between God and the devil? Was it simply a reform, or was it indeed reformation? What's the difference? Yeah. Say, well, simply two different words. They're related, but distinct. But the words we use to describe things affect, if not condition, our understanding of that which we're describing. If we describe the late medieval observant movement, the late medieval crisis, and all what was going on as simply reform attempts, that is very different from talking about them as calls for reformation and the urgency to effect and bring about a thorough reformation of church and state, head and members, that would be led by the observants within the orders who were the truly religious and who were the ones God had given the gift of interpreting and understanding the scriptures. And at this time, in this context, that was the whole ballgame. I'm not saying necessarily that to refer to the late medieval developments as reform is wrong, but I do want to point out that that is almost a belittling term, a lessening term, a term indicating that it was something less than Reformation. That, I think, is wrong. I think that is a warping of the historical record. Now, I think that's your discussion topic for this week. If it's not this week, it's coming up pretty soon. What's the difference between Reform and Reformation? And as always, there's no right answer. But there are some good arguments and some less good arguments and assumptions, and that's what part of this course is all about: is questioning our assumptions, questioning what we've assumed was the case about the Reformation, if we had any assumptions at all, to see what really was going on based on analyzing and reading the sources themselves that signify and talk about it. Anyway, we'll talk more about all this later for the next, 12 weeks or something like that, or 11 weeks in any case. I'll be looking forward to reading your text analyses, which are due the end of this week, of Jordan's exposition. If you have any questions, please just email me, and we can work on that together. As I said, too, I'm happy to read a draft. The sooner you can get me a draft, the better it will be. And if everybody sends me a draft expecting an answer the next day, I'm afraid that's not going to be possible. So it's kind of a first come, first served basis, and hopefully we can get everybody taken care of, because this is your opportunity to really engage with and deal with and analyze and interpret one of the sources from the time. This is you doing history for yourself. What did it mean at the time? And does it call up any questions in your own mind? Now, that's not what is to be in your analyses. I'm not going to grade your opinions on things. And so if you read a text analysis, Jordan was so boring, or Jordan was the greatest thing ever, I'm not going to grade that. But I can grade how well you answer the question that's given to you based on the course material, namely Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer, your analysis of it, your reading of it, and then the lectures and the introduction, chapter 1 of Luther and the Reformation of the Late Middle Ages. That I can grade, and that I will, and I'm looking forward to reading your essays. analyses. If you have any questions, again, please do contact me. And this is kind of the first fourth of the course or so, the first part of the course. Topically, it still continues a bit, and we'll be continuing next week along the same thing, still with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and still with the crisis of the later Middle Ages, because we are still in that period. We have not gotten to the real point of transition yet, but it is coming just around the corner. Thanks so much.